Jake stepped down from his horse, dust swirling around his worn boots as he surveyed what was supposed to be his investment. The afternoon sun cast long shadows between the buildings, and he could hear something he hadn't expected in a ghost town. Voices, a child coughing somewhere deep inside one of the structures. He approached the store slowly, keeping his hands visible. The woman in the doorway didn't lower her weapon, and her eyes held the kind of weariness that came from protecting something precious against impossible odds. "Ma'am," Jake said, stopping a respectful distance away. "I think there might be some confusion here." "No confusion on my end," Margaret Thompson replied, her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands. "You're the one who doesn't belong." Behind her, through the open door, Jake caught a glimpse of a makeshift living space. Blankets hung as room dividers, canned goods lined makeshift shelves, a small fire crackled in what had once been a merchant's display area. This wasn't a temporary camp. This was home. "I have the deed," Jake said, patting his jacket pocket. "Bought this whole town from the county, legal and proper." Margaret's laugh was bitter. "Legal and proper. That's what they said when they took my husband's farm. Legal and proper when they foreclosed on our house. Legal and proper when they left us with nowhere to go but here." A coughing fit echoed from deeper in the building, violent and wet. Margaret's composure cracked for just a moment, her eyes darting toward the sound before snapping back to Jake. "That's my granddaughter," she said. "She's sick and this is the only shelter we have for 100 miles in any direction." Jake felt something twist in his chest. He'd come here expecting to walk through empty buildings, maybe clean them up, figure out what kind of business venture might work in this forgotten corner of the territory. He hadn't expected to find people. He definitely hadn't expected to find a family clinging to survival in the ruins of someone else's dreams. "How long have you been living here?" he asked. 4 months, Margaret said, "since the bank took everything else." The coughing from inside grew worse, and Margaret's grip tightened on her rifle, not pointing it at him, but ready, always ready. "She needs medicine," Margaret said quietly, "and rest. And a roof that doesn't leak when it rains." Jake looked around at the buildings he now legally owned. Some had collapsed roofs, others had walls that wouldn't survive a strong wind. But here, in what had once been the town's general store, someone had created something resembling safety. But the law was the law, and the deed in his pocket was clear. He owned this land, these buildings, everything Margaret and her granddaughter were using to survive. The question was what he planned to do about it. From inside the store came the sound of something falling, followed by a weak cry for help. Margaret's rifle clattered to the ground as she rushed inside. Jake found himself following without invitation, stepping into a world that shouldn't have existed in his ghost town. The interior of the general store had been transformed into something between a home and a medical ward. Wooden crates served as furniture. Cloth strips hung from the ceiling, sectioning off areas for privacy, and in the corner on a bed made from stacked blankets and salvaged boards lay the thinnest child Jake had ever seen. Emma Thompson couldn't have weighed more than 70 pounds. Her skin was pale as winter frost, and when she coughed, her entire fragile frame shook with the effort. Dark circles shadowed her eyes, and her breathing came in short, labored gasps. "Grandma," she whispered, her voice barely audible. The water bucket tipped over. Margaret knelt beside her granddaughter, pressing a weathered hand to the girl's forehead. The tenderness in that gesture hit Jake harder than any rifle barrel pointed at his chest. "Fever's worse," Margaret murmured more to herself than anyone else. She looked up at Jake, and in her eyes, he saw something that made his stomach clench. Desperation. "She needs a doctor," Margaret said. "Real medicine, not just the herbs I've been finding out there." Jake surveyed their makeshift home. Water stains marked the walls where rain had leaked through gaps in the roof. The floor was uneven with loose boards that could trip someone in the dark. This place was barely holding together, and winter was coming. "Nearest doctor is in Riverside," Jake said. "That's a 2-day ride." "I know where it is," Margaret snapped. "You think I haven't thought of that? You think I haven't considered every option?" She stood up, hands clenched into fists. "We had money once. We had a wagon, horses, everything we needed, but the bank took it all. Said my husband had defaulted on a loan he never even signed." Emma started coughing again, and Margaret immediately returned to her side, helping her sit up to clear her lungs. The sound was wet and deep, the kind of cough that spoke of something serious taking root. "How much do you want?" Margaret asked suddenly, her voice strained. "For us to stay until spring. I can work, I can cook. Clean, men clothes, tend animals, whatever you need. Jake felt the weight of the deed in his pocket like a stone. He owned this place. Every broken board, every leaking roof, every square inch of land these people were calling home. The law gave him the right to tell them to leave, but looking at Emma's fevered face and Margaret's desperate eyes, the law felt like a cold, sharp thing he didn't want to touch. "I don't need workers," he said carefully. Margaret's face crumpled. She thought he was saying no. She thought he was about to throw them out into the desert with nothing but the clothes on their backs and a sick child who might not survive the journey to anywhere else. But before she could respond, before Jake could explain what he was really thinking, they heard the sound of horses approaching. Multiple horses moving fast. Margaret went rigid, her eyes wide with a fear that went deeper than anything Jake had seen yet. "They found us," she whispered. 3 men rode into the ghost town like they owned it, which until an hour ago they probably thought they did. Their leader was a thin man with cold eyes and a badge that caught the afternoon light. Behind him rode 2 deputies, both carrying the kind of expressions that suggested they enjoyed their work a little too much. Sheriff Daniel Stone dismounted outside the general store, his gaze moving from Jake to the smoke rising from the chimney to the garden plot that definitely hadn't been here during his last visit. "Well, well," Stone said, his voice carrying the particular satisfaction of a man who'd found exactly what he was looking for. "Margaret Thompson, you've led us quite a chase." Margaret stepped protectively in front of the doorway, blocking the sheriff's view of Emma inside. "We're not trespassing, Daniel. This land belongs to someone else now." "That's Sheriff Stone to you," he replied, but his attention had shifted to Jake. "And you'd be the fool who bought this worthless pile of rocks from the county." Jake felt something cold settle in his stomach. There was history here, the kind that left scars and bred the sort of hatred that didn't cool with time. "I have legal ownership," Jake said carefully. "The deed is clear." Stone laughed, but there was no humor in it. "Legal ownership? That's rich. Tell me, friend, did the county mention they sold you land with outstanding debts attached? Mrs. Thompson here owes a considerable sum in unpaid loans and penalties." Margaret's face went white. "Those loans were forgeries. My husband never signed anything." "Your dead husband can't testify to that," Stone said, "but his signature is on file at the bank, along with the accumulated interest and late fees. Comes to about $750 now." $750. Jake felt that number hit him like a physical blow. That was more money than most people saw in 5 years, more than Margaret could possibly have, and certainly more than he'd paid for the entire town. "She doesn't have $750, Jake said. "No, she doesn't," Stone agreed, "which is why she's coming with us. The bank has other ways of settling debts." One of the deputies stepped forward, hand resting on his gun. "Ma'am, you need to come along peaceful now." From inside the store came the sound of Emma's coughing, violent and desperate. Margaret's hands shook, but she didn't move from the doorway. "My granddaughter is sick," Margaret said. "She can't travel." "Then you should have thought of that before you ran out on your obligations," Stone replied. "The child will come too. The bank always recovers its investments." Jake felt something dark and angry unfurl in his chest. He'd seen enough frontier justice to know what happened to people who owed money they couldn't pay. Women especially, and children who couldn't work, ended up in places that decent folks didn't talk about. "What kind of work are we talking about?" Jake asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. Stone's smile was ugly. "The kind that pays off debts real efficiently." Margaret's composure finally broke. "Please," she whispered. "She's just a child. She's sick. Can't you see she's sick?" But Stone was already signaling his deputies to move forward. They approached the store like men who'd done this before, who knew exactly how to handle desperate women and sick children. That's when Jake made a decision that would change everything. He stepped between the deputies and Margaret, his hand moving to rest on his own gun. The lady said no. The silence stretched like a wire about to snap. Sheriff Stone's eyes narrowed as he studied Jake, taking in the weathered leather of his gun belt, the steady way he held himself, the complete absence of fear in his stance. "You don't want to get involved in this, friend," Stone said, his voice taking on a different tone. More cautious now, like a man who'd suddenly realized he might be dealing with someone dangerous. "Too late for that," Jake replied. "These people are on my land. That makes it my business." One of the deputies, a young man with nervous eyes, shifted his weight. "Sheriff, maybe we should just come back another time." "Shut up, Collins," Stone snapped. But his attention never left Jake. "You got any idea what you're interfering with here?" "Enlighten me." Stone spat into the dust. Mrs. Thompson's husband borrowed money from Riverside Bank, signed papers, made promises, then had the poor judgment to die before paying back what he owed. Now the debt falls to his family. Convenient, Jake said. Dead men can't dispute signatures. That's a serious accusation. It's a serious situation. Margaret remained frozen in the doorway, caught between hope and terror. Behind her, Emma's coughing had quieted, but Jake could hear her labored breathing in the silence. Stone took a step closer. You know what I think? I think you don't understand how things work around here. This territory has laws, and I enforce them. The bank has rights, and I protect them. Mrs. Thompson has debts, and I collect them. And if those debts were fabricated, that's not for you to decide. Stone's hand dropped to his gun. Now step aside. Jake didn't move. Show me the papers. What? The loan documents, the signatures. If this debt is real, prove it. For just a moment, uncertainty flickered across Stone's face. Then it was gone, replaced by cold anger. I don't have to prove anything to you. Then you don't get to take them. The deputy, named Collins, took a nervous step backward. Sheriff, this is getting out of hand. I said shut up, Stone snarled. He studied Jake for a long moment, then seemed to reach some internal decision. You want to see papers? Fine, we'll ride to Riverside, get the bank president out here with all the documentation you want, but that means waiting until tomorrow. Margaret made a small sound of relief, but Stone wasn't finished. Of course, that also means I'll be bringing a federal marshal back with me, and when he sees you interfering with the collection of legal debts, you'll be the one in chains. Jake felt the trap closing around them. Stone was giving him an out, a chance to walk away and let these people face their fate alone. All he had to do was step aside and pretend he'd never seen a sick child or a desperate grandmother. But Emma started coughing again, the sound raw and painful in the afternoon air. Jake realized he'd already made his choice back when he'd first seen Margaret standing in that doorway with a rifle in her hands and fear in her eyes. Bring your marshal, Jake said. Bring your papers. Bring whoever you want. Stone smiled, but it was the smile of a predator who just cornered his prey. You have no idea what you've just done. As the sheriff and his men rode away, Margaret finally spoke. They'll be back with enough men to take us all. Once the dust from Stone's departure settled, Margaret sank against the doorframe like all the strength had drained out of her. Jake could see her hands shaking, the weight of everything finally hitting her now that the immediate threat had passed. Why? She asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Why would you risk everything for strangers? Jake didn't have a good answer for that. Maybe it was the way Emma had looked so small and fragile in that makeshift bed. Maybe it was the desperation in Margaret's eyes when she'd offered to work for their keep. Or maybe it was just that he'd spent too many years watching powerful men crush people who couldn't fight back. Tell me about the loan, he said, instead of answering her question. Margaret was quiet for so long that Jake thought she wouldn't respond. Then she straightened, some of her earlier strength returning. My husband Robert never borrowed money from anyone, she said. He was proud that way, stubborn, said debt was just another kind of chain. She paused, looking out toward the horizon where Stone and his men had disappeared. But after he died, suddenly there were papers, documents with his signature saying he owed the bank for land improvements, equipment purchases, things we never bought. Did you see him sign anything? Never. And I handled all our business dealings. Robert couldn't read well, so I managed the paperwork. Margaret's voice turned bitter, which is why it was so convenient when I wasn't allowed to contest the debt. Women can't challenge their dead husband's legal obligations according to the bank. Jake felt anger building in his chest. He'd seen this pattern before in other towns, other territories. Banks and corrupt officials working together to steal land from families who couldn't fight back legally. From inside the store came a weak call. Grandma. Margaret immediately went to Emma's side and Jake followed. The child looked even worse than before, her skin flushed with fever and her breathing shallow. When she tried to sit up, she was too weak to manage it on her own. I'm thirsty, Emma whispered. Margaret reached for a water bucket, but it was nearly empty. The well out back still works, she told Jake. Sometimes. Jake took the bucket and headed outside. The well was old, its wooden frame weathered and cracked, but when he lowered the rope, it came back up with clear water. As he worked, he found himself thinking about $750. It was a fortune to people like Margaret, but Jake had more than that hidden in his saddlebags, money he'd saved from years of careful living and successful cattle sales. He could pay the debt. Problem solved. But something about that solution felt wrong. If he paid, he'd be admitting the debt was real. He'd be rewarding corruption and encouraging more of it. And what happened to the next family Stone and his bank decided to target? When he returned with the water, Margaret was sitting beside Emma, stroking her granddaughter's hair with infinite gentleness. "She needs medicine," Margaret said without looking up. "Real medicine from a real doctor, and she needs it soon." Stone said the nearest doctor is in Riverside. Same town where the bank is, same town where Stone has friends. Margaret finally met his eyes. "If we go there, we'll never come back." Jake set the water bucket down and considered their options. They could run, but Emma was too sick to travel far. They could hide, but Stone knew where they were now. They could fight, but that would mean shooting lawmen, even corrupt ones, and that would bring more trouble than any of them could handle. "There might be another way," Jake said slowly. "But it would mean trusting me completely." Margaret studied his face. "What kind of way?" Before Jake could answer, they heard something that made his blood run cold. Hoofbeats again, but coming from a different direction, and there were more of them this time, many more. Through the window they could see riders approaching from the east, too many to count, moving fast and kicking up a cloud of dust that spoke of urgency. But these weren't Stone's men returning early. These riders carried different colors, flew different flags, and they were riding like they owned this territory, which Jake realized with growing dread. They probably thought they did. The riders who thundered into the ghost town weren't lawmen or bank officials. They were farmers, ranchers, and working people, all armed and all carrying the same expression of desperate determination that Jake had seen in Margaret's eyes. Their leader was a woman about Margaret's age, but where Margaret showed the weariness of someone who'd been running, this woman radiated the focused anger of someone who'd decided to stop running and start fighting. "Margaret Thompson," the woman called out as she dismounted. "We've been looking for you." Margaret stepped out of the store, leaving Emma inside but staying close to the doorway. "Sarah Miller, what are you doing here?" "Same thing you are, trying to stay alive." Sarah gestured to the dozen riders behind her. "We're all families that got hit by Stone's little debt collection scheme. All of us had husbands who mysteriously signed loan papers they never actually signed." Jake felt pieces of a larger puzzle clicking into place. This wasn't just about Margaret and her family. This was bigger, more systematic. Stone and the bank weren't just stealing from one family. They were stealing from anyone who couldn't fight back. "How many?" Margaret asked. "Margaret?" 18 families so far," Sarah replied. "Maybe more." "Hard to tell since some folks just disappeared rather than fight." Her gaze shifted to Jake. "And you'd be the man who bought himself a town full of trouble." "Seems that way," Jake agreed. Sarah studied him for a moment, then seemed to reach some decision. "We know about the federal marshal Stone's bringing. We also know that Marshall's been taking money from the bank for years. This whole territory is rotten from the ground up." "So what's your plan?" Margaret asked. "Evidence," Sarah said. "Real evidence that proves the signatures were forged. And we think we know where to find it." She pulled a folded paper from her jacket. "Michael Wong, the bank clerk who's been doing the forgeries, got himself a conscience last week. Sent word that he's willing to testify, but only if we can guarantee his safety." "Where is he?" Jake asked. "Hiding in the old mining camp about 20 miles north, but Stone's got men looking for him, and if they find him first..." Sarah didn't need to finish that sentence. Margaret looked back toward the store where Emma was coughing again. "I can't leave her. She's too sick to travel." "We know," Sarah said gently. "That's why we came here. Some of us stay and protect the town. Others go get Wong and bring him back here for the marshal to hear." It was a reasonable plan, but Jake could see the flaws. If they split their forces, both groups would be vulnerable. If Stone found Wong first, their only witness would disappear. And if the federal marshal was as corrupt as Sarah claimed, evidence might not matter anyway. "There's another problem," Jake said. "Even if we prove the debts are fake, what's to stop them from just burning this place down and claiming we resisted arrest?" Sarah's smile was grim. "Nothing. Which is why we're not just gathering evidence. We're gathering witnesses. Lots of them." She gestured toward the horizon, and Jake saw more dust clouds in the distance, more riders approaching from different directions. Word spread about what's happening here. Zara continued. Newspaper men from 3 different towns are riding this way. Federal investigators from the territorial capital. Even some of the tribal leaders from the reservation are coming to see what all the fuss is about. Margaret stared at the approaching dust clouds. You're turning this into a circus. We're turning this into a public spectacle, Zara corrected. Something too big and too visible for Stone and his friends to sweep under the rug. From inside the store, Emma's coughing turned violent, followed by a weak cry for help. Margaret rushed inside and Jake followed. The child was sitting up, but her face was flushed with fever and her eyes were unfocused. Something's wrong, Margaret whispered. This is different. Worse. Jake knelt beside the makeshift bed and saw what Margaret meant. Emma's breathing was becoming more labored, and when she coughed, there were flecks of blood on her lips. We need that doctor, Margaret said, her voice breaking. We need him now. But as if summoned by their desperation, they heard a new sound from outside. A single horse approaching at a gallop, its rider pushing hard. Through the window, Jake saw Sheriff Stone returning alone, riding like the devil himself was chasing him. And when Stone dismounted, Jake could see something in the man's face that hadn't been there before. Fear. Sheriff Stone's horse was lathered with sweat, and the man himself looked like he'd seen his own grave. He dismounted with shaking hands, his eyes darting between the gathered families and the dust clouds on the horizon that promised even more arrivals. This has gone too far, Stone said, his voice lacking its earlier authority. Way too far. Sarah Miller stepped forward, her hand resting on her gun. What happened to your federal marshal, Sheriff? Stone's laugh was bitter and desperate. Marshall's dead, shot down on the road by Michael Wong. The words hit like a physical blow. Jake felt Margaret stiffen beside him while Sarah's face went pale. If their only witness had killed a federal marshal, everything changed. Wong would be hunted as a murderer now, and his testimony would be worthless. You're lying, Sarah said, but uncertainty crept into her voice. Am I? Stone pulled a blood-stained badge from his jacket. Found this on the road along with Marshal Patterson's body. Wong left a note saying he wouldn't be taken alive, that he'd rather die fighting than hang for forgery. Jake studied Stone's face and saw something that chilled him. The sheriff wasn't lying about the marshal being dead, but there was something else in his expression, something that suggested the whole truth was more complicated. Where's Wong now? Jake asked. Gone. Disappeared into the mountains with enough evidence to hang half the territory's officials. Stone's voice dropped to a whisper. Including me. The admission hung in the air like smoke from a gun barrel. Around them, the gathered families shifted restlessly, hands moving toward weapons. The situation was spiraling beyond anyone's control. Inside the store, Emma's coughing had stopped, replaced by something worse. Silence. Margaret rushed inside, and her scream brought everyone running. The child lay motionless on her makeshift bed, her skin gray and her breathing so shallow it was barely detectable. Blood stained the blanket beneath her head, and her eyes had rolled back until only the whites showed. She's dying, Margaret sobbed, cradling Emma's limp form. My baby's dying, and there's nothing I can do. Jake knelt beside them, pressing his ear to Emma's chest. Her heartbeat was rapid and weak, like a bird's wings fluttering against a window. Whatever illness had been growing inside her had reached a critical point. The nearest doctor is still 2 days away, Margaret said, her voice breaking. Even if we rode hard, even if we left right now, she wouldn't survive the journey, Jake finished quietly. Outside, they could hear more horses arriving, the newspapermen Sarah had mentioned, probably the territorial investigators, people who would want answers, explanations, someone to blame for the chaos that was unfolding. Stone appeared in the doorway, looking down at the dying child with something that might have been genuine remorse. There's a doctor in the tribal settlement, he said quietly. Old medicine man who saved folks the white doctors couldn't help. That's 30 miles through rough country, Sarah protested. 2 if you know the right trails, Stone replied. And I know them. Margaret looked up from Emma's still form, hope and suspicion warring in her eyes. Why would you help us, after everything? Stone was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice was different, older, more tired. Because I have a granddaughter too, and because I'm tired of being the kind of man who lets children die for money. But even as the words left his mouth, they heard new sounds from outside. Shouts, the distinctive crack of rifle fire, and beneath it all, the thunder of many horses approaching fast. The bank's private army had arrived, and they weren't coming to negotiate. The bank's hired guns rode into the ghost town, expecting to find helpless families cowering in the ruins. Instead, they found themselves facing 24 armed settlers, 3 newspaper reporters with cameras, and a territorial investigator who'd been documenting corruption across the region for months. The shooting was brief and decisive. When the smoke cleared, half the bank's men were wounded, the others had surrendered, and their leader was demanding to speak with whoever was in charge. "That would be me," Jake said, stepping forward with his gun still drawn. The leader, a scarred man named Richards, spat blood into the dust. "You got no idea what you're messing with. The bank owns this whole territory." "Not anymore," said a new voice. The territorial investigator, a thin man named Peterson, approached with a leather satchel full of documents. "Michael Wong didn't kill that marshal. He saved him. Marshal Patterson is alive and recovering in the tribal settlement, along with enough evidence to shut down Riverside Bank permanently." Stone's face went white. "But the badge, the blood." "Wong's blood," Peterson explained. "Man took a bullet protecting the marshal from the real killers. Same men who'd been forging signatures and stealing land for years." The truth hit like a sledgehammer. Stone hadn't been trying to protect a corrupt system. He'd been manipulated by it, used as an unwitting tool by people who saw him as disposable. But none of that mattered to Margaret, who was still cradling Emma's unconscious form. The child's breathing had become so shallow that each breath might be her last. "She needs help now," Margaret said desperately. Stone looked at the dying child, then at his horse, then made a decision that would define the rest of his life. "I'll take her to the tribal doctor. I know the trails, and my horse is fresh." "I'm coming with you," Margaret said. "And me," Jake added. They fashioned a travois from blankets and wooden poles, carefully securing Emma for the rough journey ahead. As they prepared to leave, Zara approached with something in her hands. "This came with the investigator," she said, handing Margaret an official-looking document. "Declaration that all the forged debts are void. You're free, Margaret. All of you are free." The ride to the tribal settlement tested every skill Stone possessed as a horseman and tracker. They pushed through narrow canyon passes, forded rushing streams, and climbed rocky slopes that would have broken lesser men. But Stone's knowledge of the land proved true, and what should have been a day's journey took only 7 hours. The tribal doctor, an elderly man named Thomas Eagle Feather, examined Emma with gentle hands and knowing eyes. He worked with herbs and traditional medicines, but also with techniques he'd learned from white doctors years before. "Pneumonia," he said simply, "but not too late. Not yet." For 4 days, they stayed in the tribal settlement while Emma fought for her life. Margaret never left her granddaughter's side, and Jake found himself helping with whatever needed doing. Stone, meanwhile, spent his time writing a detailed confession about everything he knew regarding the bank's corruption. On the 5th day, Emma opened her eyes and asked for water. 8 months later, the ghost town had a new name, Hope Valley. Jake had divided his land among the families who'd been cheated by the bank, keeping only enough for a small ranch where he raised cattle and grew vegetables. Margaret ran the general store, which actually sold goods now, and Emma had grown strong enough to help with the daily operations. Stone had served his time in territorial prison and returned to work as Hope Valley's sheriff, this time protecting the people instead of the powerful. The Riverside Bank had been dissolved, its assets distributed to the families it had wronged. As autumn painted the hills around their settlement, Jake stood in his garden watching Emma chase chickens while Margaret tended to customers in the store. He'd bought a ghost town for $90 and found something worth far more than money. He'd found a family.
And sometimes, in the quiet moments between sunset and starlight, he could hear the ghost town's true spirits. Not the restless dead, but the living dreams of people who'd finally found a place to call home.